So, may I request Aman now, Amarnath, who will talk on how governments prefer fossils to heritage.
Thank you. I actually changed the title of my presentation because it seemed a bit too harsh. I thought they were senior members of government. Um, so it's now called um, Burying the Designs of India's Past. Okay. Even though I was told to talk about my work, I am actually more interested in the generic problems, which I think are more interesting for us to discuss than to show one's work. But I will divide it in two bits. Also show lots of pictures because you've heard lots of words. So when you are in New Delhi, you see the Arc of Triumph from Paris, which is built here because Lutyens went to Paris and he loved it, so he wanted to reproduce it here. He also, there's a lot of correspondence from the British about the Champs-Élysées. They say the King's Way, which is Rajpath, should be that much bigger because their whole competition is Versailles this much, so we have to make the governor's palace bigger and so on. So they are doing, the British are outdoing the French on Indian soil because the Buckingham Palace isn't large enough like Versailles. Baker is the one who's won the competition to build Delhi. So this is Pretoria, and this is what looks like Vijay Chowk. So if you see this, so what we are getting here is actually something which is totally irrelevant to us. Edwin Lutyens wanted to build the Church of Rome as the house of the Governor General because he thought it was the most beautiful monument building. And he said, we will fit, the bathrooms and bedrooms into this. It will be fantastic. And what we eventually get is this. Because Lord Hardinge is the Viceroy, so look at the design inputs. On top we have a 3rd century Buddhist stupa. This is Islamic kiosks which come with all the wonderful buildings. This is a Renaissance first floor, and at the bottom is the native floor, which is Ellora. I'll show you. This is the first drawing of Lutyens of Sanchi Stupa, not because he wanted it. He wanted to build the Church of Rome, but Lord Hardinge said to him, we are spending Indian money to give them a building of which they should be civilizationally proud. So at least from the outside, make it slightly Indian. Inside, of course, it will be Edwardian because we have to live in it and we rule them. So it's actually, he sent to Mandu to see this. He comes back and says it's utter rubbish. But he uses some of his genius to make all the kiosks that you see on top. He inverts them and makes them into fountains. But this is Ellora. This is the entrance, the bottom from where the staff and servants had to enter. So he said he would make a native entrance, and Ellora was the native architecture, cave architecture, because we live in caves. All these jalis that you see in the Rashtrapati Bhavan are all copied from the Red Fort. These are very detailed designs of that. And this is what Lutyens, the architect, has to say about one of his fellow architects. He says, Swinton Jacob, he says, his buildings are culled from various buildings of various dates put together with no sense of relation or scale. But what about his own building? That nobody is here to judge. So what does India get? India gets Roman architecture because they're trying to make an imperial point, which goes back to 44 BC. Then in England, then Palladio actually evokes it in the 14th century or 16th century. Then Inigo Jones and Christopher, they're English architects who then revive it, and we get this in 1912. It is a Renaissance, and we are supposed to imagine this as an Indian building and be very proud of it. So we have no eyes to see what design is. We are so gullible, we accept anything that anybody gives us, and we say, what an extraordinary building. I've actually done a book for the President of India, which is called Dome Over India, which details all this. And if you read it, you'd feel very unhappy that we have people like Lachans who says, personally, I do not believe there's any real Indian architecture or any great tradition. And Taj Mahal is wonderful, but it is not architecture. And its beauty begins where architecture ceases to be. And we today have, we call the Lachans Bungalow Zone in Delhi, Lachans Bungalow Zone, when not one bungalow in that is made up by him. So we have no sense of history. A man who hates us, this is what he says about Indians. He calls us black Moors, niggers, dark and ill-smelling. He finds our food strange and so on. So he says we have very low intelligence, and he cannot admit them to be on the same plane as myself. And here we are, honoring this man who even the British Empire, it was called New Delhi when it was suggested that they should call it Mary Baad and George Garh and all that. But the emperor said, forget it, just call it New Delhi. So after independence, we wake up and say, oh, here's this great British architect because he's British, and name everything after him. There's even a hotel. And I did an analysis of the Taj Mahal, which is an equilateral triangle, and Viceroy's House or Rashtrapati Bhavan. If you look at the triangles and the shapes, you'll get to see how imperfect Lachans' building is. And to go even further, this is an Englishman who's being honest. He says, Lachans took Indian architecture and used it in his own way while noisily saying how inferior he thought it was. And Robert Byron, who's a writer of that time, talks about never was so large, so planned, so arrogant and so lovely a palace built. And I shall now show you the proportions of this dome. The dome of this building is 2.5 times that of its base. There is this wonderful thing in Islamic architecture called a pishtaq, which is a structure which is built to cover the naked neck of the dome, which this man doesn't know anything about. And if we were to take the same example, this is what the Rashtrapati Bhavan is, which is perfect poetry and all that the British call it, I also took the liberty, because there's this Lachans Trust who glorifies him and thinks the holiest architect, of taking his building. This is the front view, this is the back view. And if you see these little kiosks, which are totally unproportionate because it's a U-shaped building and in the distance we lose the scale. So this yellow structure is what I have done with his building, and you can see that that triangle that we are talking about is much more perfect. This is not how the building is. This is how it should have been, and this is how it is. These little mousy kiosks over here. So what I'm actually saying is that why don't we as Indians have the courage to see how we are different? We are the only living civilization in the whole world. I'll go back to this. The only living civilization of the ancient world. The Greek, the Roman, the Mesopotamian, Babylonian, even the Chinese have all destroyed themselves. So we must have many points of great strength. Look how India deals with Islam, which is considered a threat, invasion, and so on. Countries like Syria, Jordan were taken by the Arabs within a few days. Egypt took 20 days to be brought to its knees. Iraq took 3 months, Persia 3 years. And 400 years after Islam came to India, they became its rulers. So rather than take destruction, there was a lot of destruction. There were 28 Hindu and Jain temples in Delhi, which were destroyed to make the Qutub Minar. But what India does with it is, it turns even destruction into syncretism, and we get, let's say, the Tree of Life, which is not so beautiful in any other Islamic country or any other country which had a face-off or a simulation of Islam. And just look at the magic that India turns it to. I'm just running very quickly through this. These are things you know. But to know that such extraordinary beauty comes because of this marriage between these two, however abrasive it was at the beginning. Okay, this is, I'm now coming a little bit to the design point. My closest friend from childhood said to me to design a house for him, which I did. This is a house in Faridabad. And he said, you've created a huge problem for me because people come every day, stop outside and say, can we see it from inside? I said, you can ticket it if you want, but he wanted to enter it for the UNESCO because he read there was some award for some architecture, and he entered it. He got a letter from that saying that the house was very derivative. Now, derivative is a derogatory word which we don't use for the Rashtrapati Bhavan. We don't say it's derivative of Rome, but why should anybody building an Indian building in India be told by an outsider there's derivative? But where else should it derive from, you know? This is the entrance of the house. This is the Tulsi Chowk. As you enter there, you look up. This is made with the 16th century old bricks. I'm not an architect, I'm a historian, but I take the liberty of practicing architecture. So these are three words which are now considered pejorative: derivative, revivalist, and ethnic. It applies to Indians doing the Indian thing. So actually, when we are discussing design, whatever your institutes will, I think it's very important for students and for teachers to know what is fusion, what is hybrid, where does it become mongrel, you know, when you get all the wrong ends of the genetics, and where does it become harmonized, syncretic, integrated. This is actually subject for a much more exciting talk than 8 seconds or 8 minutes. But the tragedy is that we are so falsely obsessed by our doing ourselves to be someone else just to please others. It's something which is very peculiar to us. And I was thinking of a ridiculous example of this, which is this. Almost as if we wanted to dress our grandmothers in miniskirts because the West was coming to see how modern we were. So today what happens is the architects, I was talking to a colleague, says that, you know, everybody's hiring Singapore architects and making their offices, hiring Indian architects to be their sort of junior assistants and all to handle them, because none of the rich Marwaris who want to build these houses have faith in Indian architects. But they don't mind them as the second people. And then just a bit about my work, and I'm unhappy actually that Dr. Petroda left, because much of what he said is not true, because I've actually been doing what Gandhi said. He said, find purpose and the means will follow. I have been involved for 30 years in restoration, have done 30 buildings, have financed it myself, created lots of employment, seen that rural people do not migrate to the cities, and at the end of it all, the only obstacle that we face throughout is the government. So it's all very well to say this government has done fantastic work, but if everybody is ready to vote it out, there must be some reason. So this is Nimrana, for those of you who don't know it, which was an utter ruin. It's a 15th century fort, and it was on the market for 40 years. So it was bought for 7 lakh rupees, but nothing is cheap on the market for 40 years. And it has now been turned into a heritage site. These are views of it. I'm just rushing through it. This is a bungalow on the beach, a Danish building, because the Danes bought from the Raja of Thanjavur some land to trade in pepper. Because pepper, not because they used to eat it, but because it was very good for conserving the animals in winter. So this is a 400-year-old building which is on the sea, and this is what we did with it. And all that we had from the government of Tamil Nadu was to come and say, how dare you build something so close on the coastline? So we said it's been there for 400 years, just in case they hadn't noticed it, and that we were only restoring it. And everybody kept saying, all you have to do is to go with a bag. So people always say, you should have a liaison officer who does all that work for you. But what is that work? If you're restoring India's heritage, do you need to bribe people to do that? Absolutely amazing. This is Tijara, Fort Palace. It would have been lovely if this conference was actually held here. We have lots of place for you, and you would have been a more captive audience, not able to escape. These are some before and after pictures. We have a 60-year lease on this, and this is 3.5 years after. The government of Rajasthan has made a nuisance of themselves to send warrants of arrest for us, because we distributed sweets, which we do every weekend for all the labor, because somebody spread a rumor that a forest officer had died, and we were celebrating that because he was sitting on our file. Perhaps, you know. And I, of course, had no idea that he had died because we had nothing to do with it. But this is the level at which you are treated. These are just some fun before and after pictures. And, and the references, the few people who've been here, this is a before picture. I'll show you the next one. Now, people come here and say, actually, this is much bigger than the Hanging Gardens of Babylonia, or that it looks like Machu Picchu. We have no points of reference which relate to our own self-identity, our pride, our dignity in doing something, And everybody says, apply for the UNESCO award, but who wants the UNESCO chapa? Why can't we just be ourselves and be content with that idea? These elephants are made by a master craftsman from Odisha. This is at the top of the balustrade of the staircase. And this is what this place looks. That utter ruin. And this is another amazing building which is constructed now, which is an underground stepwell, which I had the idea to. I think that the IITs should really be built underground, like the Jodhpur one, because it's such a hot country. So this is a building that I have designed and built. Um, it's very simple. You dig a hole, you build a building, and the earth that you've dug out of the building you put on top of it. So this is the building during the construction. Just 2-3 quick pictures, and what it eventually becomes when you enter it underground. It's got a lot of light wells, and there are 32 rooms to live here. This is meant to be a spa, but this is totally indigenous, and nobody's looking at this. I'd like to end perhaps by saying something that I read, that we design people are marginalized people, and we often achieve as individuals what we cannot achieve as a group. So I think that we are meeting here to see how we can as a group perform together. And if there's any saving grace, there is a wonderful saying that said 30 years of the rule of the Borgias in Italy were the worst years of murder and bloodshed, and corruption and all that you can imagine. And those are the years that gave Italy Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And Switzerland has had years and years of peace, and all they invented was the cuckoo clock. So perhaps we should be grateful for all the harassment that we get from governments, because that perhaps is the challenge that makes us do what we do. Thank you.